rabbis have said, and maybe this is kind of influencing some of what we're looking at too, the rabbis have said that maybe this is a little bit deeper, as Rabbi said earlier. Maybe this is deeper than just physical ailments. Maybe this idea of purity and impurity also goes to who we are as people. So as Alana said, we can't really look at someone and say, well, maybe they're a lousy person. But the rabbis found a direct link between the type of afflictions we have and the actions that we do, especially when it involves our speech. So the sin of lashon hara, or ill speech, or malicious gossip, is capable of bringing about this impurity. Okay, so the rabbi said that. So a question, is that in the text? It's an interesting question, right? So it doesn't maybe say so explicitly. So the rabbis are drashing off the fact that Miriam receives her tzara, her skin disease, because she's speaking maliciously about Moses. So that's how they make their connection and say her lashon hara made sure that she got some skin ailments. Okay? But the rabbis also asked the question, why did Aaron not get skin ailments? I don't want to actually say the answer right now because it's not the most beautiful thing in the world, and it's also probably a sermon in and of itself. But we'll just say that it's because he's a man and not a woman. Okay, so let me ask you a question. If this concept of lashon hara is not explicit in the text, then my question for us is, in the text, in the Parshat, in the very superficial level of this text, is purity and impurity a system of values? Is it bad to be impure? No? I heard no. Raise your hand if you say no. Okay, is it bad to be impure? Raise your hand if you say yes. Okay, we seem pretty split. Okay. So I think this is... So for those of you who said that it is a bad thing to be impure, why is it bad to be impure? Now that I got up here, I'm going to go back down here. What do you say, Manny? So that's the question, right? That's what we have to ask. What is our definition of impurity? Because in English, when we hear the words pure and impure, it is so difficult for us to not put a value judgment on it. We hear impure and we connect it to all these other types of things. When you go to the store and you want to buy something, you want pure honey, you want pure chocolate, you want everything to be pure. Pure is good, impurity is bad. Pure arsenic. Oh, interesting. Fasting. Oh, pure necessarily does not have to be good. Okay. I like it. Right. So the consequence is that if you have to be isolated and you have to be removed from your community, that's negative. Right? And so I would agree with you. But so let's talk about some of these reasons, some of these ways of becoming impure, of becoming tameh. So yes, there are skin illnesses, but there's also childbirth, the birth of a child. Do we think that's negative? That's also crucial for the community. What about brit milah? It's another way of becoming impure. Intercourse is another way of becoming impure. All of these things that are separated, and if we look at the underlying theme of them, it does seem that there are some that have some physical ailments to them, but there are also things that the thread connecting all of them is that they're very human. These are all things that are incredibly human. So we have this system, and it's an interesting system that when God decides to dwell within the Jewish people, within the Israelite camp, God sets up God's place, God's home in the Mishkan, in this traveling ark, and that if anyone wants to be in this area of holiness, that person has to be pure. And to be pure, that person has to remove themselves from part of what makes them human. So I want to argue that this isn't a bad thing. It's not a negative quality that's attached to this, but it's the idea that if you want to approach God and if you want to talk to God, you have to be as close to God as humanly possible. That means that if you've given birth, if you've had intercourse, if you've touched blood, if you've done things that are very human, carnal, mortal things, that somehow separates you from the holiness that is God. So to be outside of the camp is to say you are human. You have done something human. Not that you've done something negative, not that you've done something wrong. I think going back to Alana's point, it's very pertinent and it's very important for us to notice that it doesn't say that you become impure by stealing. You don't reach a state of impurity by harming someone else. You don't reach a state of impurity by doing avodah zarah or doing idol worship. These are not what puts you in a state of impurity. All of these things are a state of sin, which is very different than the purity and the impurity that we see in our text. But we also have to understand that something radically changed in Jewish history, and that is that God no longer dwelled in that sacred place that God had always wanted to dwell in. So after the Mishkan, there's the construction of the temple. God's presence is in the temple, and then the temple is destroyed. So just as with the Mishkan, when you were to approach the temple, you were supposed to be in a place of purity, you were to immerse in a mikvah, you were supposed to offer sacrifices, you were supposed to eliminate all of the parts of you as close as you can that make you human, that make you flesh and blood, so that you can approach something that's much bigger than flesh and blood. But with the destruction of the temple, we have a very different theology. It says that God's presence, the Shekinah, went into exile with the Israelites. So that while they were dispersed across the world, while we were dispersed across the world, God's presence decided to dwell with us wherever we may be. According to this, we are no longer scared that if we don't reach a state of physical purity, that God will leave us the same way we were scared of in the Mishkan or in the temple, but rather that if we're not in a state of purity, then God's not going to decide to dwell amongst us, period. And this is a very different idea, because the way that we used to eliminate these ideas of ritual impurity was by a sacrificial system. When the Shekinah is in exile, when God's presence is in exile with the Jewish people, God says, I no longer desire your offerings. I no longer desire your korbanot. I want you to do acts of kindness. I want you to be good to one another. The rabbis have said that no longer without a sacrificial system, the new sacrificial system is no longer avodat korbanot. It is no longer the work of sacrifices. It is avodat halev, the work of the heart, the service of the heart, prayer, tefillah. The way that we reach our purity is by talking to God and by bringing God into the world, instead of casting ourselves out of the community in hopes that God, in fear that God would also depart from us. So we're going to look at a couple of other texts now. If you can grab your source sheets. And for the sake of time, I'll have you turn to the back page. So it starts with the Kedushat Levi on the top of the page. And the Kedushat Levi was a Hasidic rabbi who wrote a commentary on the Torah, talking about the different spiritual and mystical elements that is found in the Torah. And on our Parshat, the Kedushat Levi wrote, this is directly from Tzora, I will inflict an eruptive plague upon the house that has become your ancestral possession. And the Kedushat Levi says, how are we supposed to interpret this? The reader is referred to Rashi, who sees in this verse good tidings for the owner of such a house. Good tidings if it's infected. This is because the plague of Tzorat, which requires the owner to tear down the whole house, will reveal treasures buried underneath by the previous owner, amounting to far more in value than the whole house is worth. Our second text from Brachot, from the Talmud, drashes on a different verse coming from the Tanakh. Why is the word tents juxtaposed as streams, as it is written in Bamidbar? As streams stretch forth, as gardens by the riverside, as aloes planted by the Lord, as cedars by the water. The Talmud says that we shouldn't read ahalim, we shouldn't read this as aloes planted by the Lord, as cedars by the water. The Gemara vocalizes the word ohalim, tents, rather than ahalim. They are juxtaposed in order to tell you, just as streams elevate a person from ritual impurity to purity after he immerses himself in their water, so too do the tents of Torah elevate a person from the scale of guilt to the scale of merit. What we see here is a rabbinic decree saying that no longer do we believe in that idea of physical impurity, that it is our physical impurity that keeps God away from us, but rather it says that our attention needs to be paid now to our spiritual impurities. That being impure in a physical sense is part of what it means to be human. That being impure in a spiritual sense is part of what it means to be human. To be angry, to be sad, to be jealous, to feel guilty, to feel shame. These are what it means to be human. But that impurity isn't bad. It's not a negative quality to have those things. In fact, it's dafka the opposite. That understanding our humanity, understanding where we are with our impurities, whether they be physical or spiritual, that the jewels, that the treasure that lies beneath them is being able to understand with our connection to God, with our connection to the spiritual realm, how we uncover those jewels that lie deep within of those different traits. So just as our text from the Kedushat Levi says, this is because the plague of Sarat, which requires the owner to tear down the whole house, will reveal treasures buried underneath by the previous owner, amounting to far more in value than the whole house is worth. So our rabbis now say the Shekhinah is in exile. God's in exile with us. And every single one of us, in some part of our lives or another, in different moments of our lives, is impure. But our impurity is part of who we are. And it is our job, it is our role as people, as Jews, as people that have signed on to this covenant, to this mission of the Jewish people, to recognize that we are people with flaws, with impurity, but it's those flaws and the impurity that allows us to talk to God, to connect to God, and to uncover the beauty that exists in our relationship with God. So as we approach this complicated and difficult Shabbat of trying to figure out these different laws of purity and impurity, of skin diseases and illnesses, let us remember that every single one of us has a responsibility, and that responsibility is to recognize who we are. Not to cancel out those things that make us human, but to embrace the things that make us human, but to use them to serve each other, to serve our families, to serve our friends, and to talk to God. Because it is when we use who we are as people, flaws and all, that is how we become pure. So on this Shabbat of illnesses, of diseases, of childbirth, of death, of blood, I say we embrace it. I say that we are all people. We all have our different flaws. But on this Shabbat, let us embrace the fact that we are all people. Let us take those flaws and imperfections with us to our Shabbat tables, into the week. Let us treat one another with love, with respect, and let us carry those blessings over so that we keep the Shekhinah with us wherever we may go. Shabbat Shalom.